there are some women that are powerful and some women that are not powerful. Who exactly is not powerful? Which human beings are not exactly powerful? But I do think some people don't feel like they can bring it out. They don't feel like they can show it and do it. And so I guess I would encourage everybody, men and women, to have hope that you can find your way through this so that you can each be your full self.
Many women experience that they can access their power and ambition and accomplishment in professional contexts, and it's not the same path or journey to do so at home. It's been a while since I have welcomed my husband, Rodd Stockwell, back to the Intimate Marriage Podcast. I'm so glad you're with me today. Thank you for being here.
Hello, everybody.
I want to talk with you about how to love a strong woman, how to love a powerful woman. And one of the reasons I want to address this is that as women, we are very familiar with the idea that if I'm too powerful, if I am too emotional, if I make too much money, if I am too much, that will be a challenge to my husband. So many a woman are then left with a kind of internal fork in the road. Do I dial down? Do I just not go for it with all the passion and ambition that wants to throb in my veins? Or do I go for it knowing that I'm going to alienate my husband and there's going to be disconnection because for me to be my full, powerful self, it's going to be hard for his fragile ego to take it. Let's talk about this from the man's perspective. Just a little bit more context I want to set is that what I've just described as a kind of quandary, that has been real for me too. I used to be so tame in my interactions with Rodd, and there are many sources of my method of uncompromising intimacy, but one of them is realizing that the more real, the more self-expressed, the more of my genuine fullness. I'm not talking about bravado and overamplification, but just my genuine life-size joie de vivre. The more that I inhabit that, the more passionate and connected our marriage became. So that's just like a little bit of background. And then specifically, this really came up during Honeymoon 2.0, the luxury couples retreat that I co hosted in Maui in October, where I led, I taught, I was in the front of the room, I brought the transformational content. I definitely was in charge of what was happening. My husband, Rodd, was at the back of the room, actively supporting me. But that's not how the men interpreted it. So, with that, I want to turn to you. You want to start somewhere else? Go ahead.
Well, I'm really looking forward to you interviewing me, but I have a question for you first. And I'm curious to know when you were in that phase where you weren't sure about bringing your whole self forward in our marriage, were there things that I was doing that were causing you to feel like you needed to hold yourself back or turn the dial down? How much of it was things that I was doing versus kind of your fears and worries that it's socially inappropriate to be big?
I would say that I first was responding to what you were doing. And then after you actually became available for my full self, then I discovered all of this societal conditioning inside myself that I needed to face in order to really be self expressed. So, in terms of what you were doing, basically, as soon as I would have more emotional presence, more content, dream bigger, express how I felt with the fullness that it lived in me, my amazing husband would just like shrink and internally crumple before my eyes when I would talk about what kind of vacation I wanted to go on, or what kind of date night would delight me, or how sad I felt about something you did or about something that had nothing to do with you. In other words, my experience was that you had a particular tolerance set point. And if I went above that, it activated all of your alarm bells and you did not feel safe internally. And it took years of being married to you to get to really know the terrain. Like, where was the set point on issues that had nothing to do with you? Where was the set point on issues that had to do with you? And I felt like a lot of getting to know you involved learning what was going to work for you. And it's not that I wanted to accommodate you, it's just that if I expressed myself and you internally dehydrated, became crumpled, and felt unsafe, that was not a win for me. It's not that I accommodated for the purpose of you feeling more comfortable, but I kept myself small because feeling connected with you was my priority. And I didn't want to blow out our connection.
So, what I want to say in this conversation about that whole time and that whole dynamic is, from my experience, from my point of view, it had to do with my fears. And I didn't have fears about you being powerful or you being bigger. I had fears about my, like, what I was comfortable with going out in the world and doing. So if you would share how enthusiastic you were, hey, let's go off to Hawaii and let's go do this and do that, it would trigger my fears about travel and is it safe to travel? And, it's a long plane ride and is that going to be comfortable for me? I had to go through a process of growing in relation to my fears so that life in general, including your brainstorming, wouldn't trigger them. But I never, from my side, experienced it as you being too much or you being too powerful. It was more like life in general was scary and dangerous, and I didn't feel confident on the inside to take on all of life circumstances. So I just want to point to the fact that there was a growth process for me to not feel threatened in general that also was being triggered by our dynamic back then.
Okay, well, I always love having you on the podcast because many people tell me when you join me, it's their favorite episodes are the ones that you're on. But I also really enjoy it because in sharing with other people, we end up having conversations that we've never had before, including this one. So I really love hearing this. And in hindsight, it makes sense to me. But it did not make sense to me because you are not a fearful person. You do not have a lot of anxieties. Like, what you're describing in terms of your inner world needs to be put in the context of you being a super competent physician. Residents, you were their favorite person to work with in the ER because of how calm you were in all kinds of fear inducing circumstances. And you have a black belt in martial arts. Like, you are a very competent person. And so the only time that I would see your fears triggered is when I was self expressed and present. It's understandable that I interpreted that as essentially a response to me. As I know you, it was all about your own internal insecurities. And I think it's really, really important to highlight that. I suppose if we break it down, was triggering for you because of your fears and insecurities, which then in turn was triggering for me because of my fears and insecurities as a woman being too powerful. And I thought that's what it was, which then explains why, as you did your work and worked through your fears and insecurities and just became so much more confident and comfortable inside yourself, in a way that your bandwidth for how I show up just grew and grew and continues to grow. Like, I don't hit this ceiling anymore, But then it paved the way for me to face my own internally imposed and kind of societally given ideas about how successful and how self-expressed I could be.
Yeah, and I wanted to say one more thing before we move off this topic, because I'm totally agreeing with what you're saying, that there's the internal process in me or the man, and there's the internal process in the woman, which are both big, big, big component of this question that you're asked in general. The one thing I want to say before we leave this part of the topic is that one reason, anyway, that comes to mind why it was different for me, how I was in the hospital or how I was walking around on the streets feeling like I could defend my woman if I needed to with my martial arts training. It's kind of something deep and intimate, but basically, my experience as a man is there's like home base. The analogy would be a mother with her 3-year-old. So the 3-year-old feels confident and safe in the mother's zone around her skirts. And so the 3-year-old can go off and explore in the world, knowing that she can come back or he can come back and feel safe close to the mother. And the fact that the mother is a safe and sturdy and familiar place that is reliable means that the 3-year-old can go off and have age appropriate adventures and then come back and feel safe. And similarly for me, I felt like, oh, I can go off and do all these things in the world as long as things are very stable and safe feeling in our home relationship. And when there was the opportunity to shake things up, that was like shaking me up on a deeper level because I felt like my home base was being shooken up. So that's why it could trigger fears in me. And I would say that my personal growth process around that was to not feel that my home base was you or our relationship or our house that we were living in, but an internal place inside myself. And once I grew to the point of feeling that safe place within myself, then a lot of other things became possible because it wouldn't trigger the fears in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's really significant because my experience of that was that you were no longer looking for a certain kind of validation from me and affirmation. This came up actually in a coaching session recently. There's a way in which a woman feels like she needs to parent her husband, and there is this whole dynamic that develops, and it has to do with an inclination to feeling responsible and controlling for the woman. And it has to do with a man needing to really find his home base and center within himself. Because as long as that's in her and how she feels about him, there's this unbalanced kind of dynamic between them, which there's a whole lot to say about it. But one thing is that it is not good for passion and erotic energy.
Right. That dynamic is a huge, so that's kind of the next step in my mind, besides the internal growth, is what's the dynamic playing out between the two of us or between the two people? Because if it's a parent child dynamic in either direction, I think that's problematic. It's going to lead to intimacy problems or whatever. So it's a question of how can I be the man? How can I be the provider and provide some caretaking of my woman, my object of my sexuality, and not put her in a child role, or vice versa, have the woman be the parent and the man be in the child role. So changing that, I think, is the second big step here to dealing with the strong woman question.
Yes. And from the woman's perspective, the key is for me to allow myself to feel supported without being young and childish in order to get that.
Right. And there's a whole bunch of layers of that to grow through too.
Yeah.
On
So,
both sides. How can the man accept support from his woman, which is sometimes harder? and but not be in a child role and vice versa.
I do want to move into what experience we had at Honeymoon 2.0 as
Right.
pertains to this. And if you're listening and this is talking your language and whatever your circumstances are, please send your questions. We will revisit this topic together and it will be more relevant to you if you let me know what you're thinking. And most of all, what do you want to hear more about? We will be glad to honor that. You can DM me on any social media channel and go to my website to the contact page, alexandrastockwell.com/contact. And you can send me, there's a place there to send a communication about the podcast, and you're welcome to do that. So when you went into Honeymoon 2.0, knowing that it wasn't our event or your event, it was my event, what was your thinking? Did you have any thoughts about any aspect of that?
Right. So for me, and this is the thing that came up in that men's group that I led. And we were talking about what does it mean to be a man, and what does it mean to be a man with these particular strong women who were part of their respective couples. I have experienced in the world, but also in that group had some mixed feelings about the like standard, typical, stereotypical masculine qualities and whether they actually even aspired to embody them or not. Well, and also what qualities does your woman respond to in terms of intimacy and sexuality? What's attractive to her? If I have too much feminine in me, that's not necessarily going to be attractive to my partner. But the point is that one thing that is vital, which we already talked about, is from my point of view, the man to have internal locus of home base and safety and security. And then the second thing was really lining up. So walking into this Honeymoon 2.0 experience, my view was not like I'm going to be the servant and you're going to tell me what to do and I'll just run around and do things for you. Instead, my view was I'm going to be the provider. I'm going to provide a safe place for you to be able to express yourself the same way I earn the money and got us the home that you and the children can live in, and as a result, the children can grow and develop and be themselves because I provided the context monetarily and spatially for them to do that. I was coming in wanting to provide and support the space that would allow you and my partner and all of the children, all the students, to grow and flourish and develop in the way that they wanted. I didn't actually think about that. It was just obvious to me that that was my role until we started to talk in this group of men. And I realized how triggering it was for them to see me at the back and you at the front because it violated some kind of ideas they had in their head. They weren't seeing the way that I was the provider and in my masculine until we talked it through. And that was a big revelation to them and a reminder of how much it matters how you line up to the archetypes involved in your heart when you take action or speak or whatever.
Yeah, and I think I will generalize this that there's training you and I have both had that one can lead from the front of the room, one can lead from the middle of the room, and one can lead from the back of the room in any kind of presentation context. But for a lot of people, it was surprising to see that you, a full fledged physician, would choose to sit in the back of the room while your woman was doing all the presenting. And for us, it actually felt quite natural. But if I had thought of you in a demoted position, it wouldn't have actually done for me what it did because I really felt your devotion, not your demotion.
Right. And I'll say two things. One is that leading from the front of the room is hard. Like there's a lot of things that someone needs to have their attention on. And so when other people that are part of your team, or in this case, me in the back of the room, can be attending to a lot of those other things, it is supportive. And so when you feel supported, it makes it easier for you to shine and do your work. And so that was my job, was how can I support you? And the other part of this I want to point to is an analogy. So this is not what the dynamic was between us, but part of putting in the group of men's minds the different dynamics that could be happening between someone standing in the front of the room and someone standing in the back of the room. You could have what they were imagining, which is you're doing everything and I'm just twiddling my thumbs and not part of things, and kind of like a servant or something. And then there's kind of what we were doing, which was co-creating the event. But also, hypothetically, you could have a mentor situation where the person in the back of the room has been doing this for 20 years and they're mentoring and supporting someone who's now the person in the front of the room. And so the person in the back of the room is holding things and aware of things because that person has all that experience, and making it possible for the person in the front of the room to grow and develop and shine. And it's not that easy as a student sitting in the audience to see which of those is actually going on, but it makes a big difference for the person who's the strong woman.
Yeah. And while you're talking about this, you are chief of a department in a large medical system near where we live. And so there are various events. I sometimes go as your spouse. People are so respectful and deferential towards you and like just excited to have a little bit of your attention. And mostly they ignore me. I had the sense that anybody has any idea that I'm an interesting person and I have some expertise in the world because people's attention is entirely on you. So I'm just kind of thinking through that, yes, there's the energetic dynamics between the two of us, which is really the thing I wanted to highlight in this conversation. And then there's what it looks like to other people. And part of having a really connected, intimate marriage is just not being attached to what it looks like to other people and being entertained by it or educated by it, but not having it mean anything. And I think that if the men observing you at the back of the room had the same feedback with the way that people interact with me as your spouse, and there's like no other content to the interaction. And I want to emphasize that the reason none of it's an issue is because of the individual growth you have done, the individual growth I have done, and the relational growth that we have done with one another.
It's a learnable skill.
It is totally a learnable skill. There actually are multiple couples that I have coached to work together. If one of you is the boss and one of you isn't, or if you're both the boss, or if you're two employees and someone else is the boss, that it all creates really complicated dynamics. And so if you have the experience that you either hold back at home or you hold back at work because of the power dynamic between the two of you personally and professionally, I invite you to reach out because that can all be harmonized and evolved through private relationship and intimacy coaching with me. It's really extraordinary how much better those dynamics can get without a whole lot of attention and time because you both have blind spots. It's not possible that you would both be really aware of the whole dynamic. And so when I bring my sight and attention to that dynamic, couples are always amazed how quickly what has been stressful becomes harmonious and collaborative. And then taking that into a professional context is a lot more fun than it is for many people who work together.
Excellent.
Well, anything else you want to say, my powerful man beside me?
I think we covered it. The only problem I have with this is the idea that there are some women that are powerful and some women that are not powerful. I was chewing on that because I thought, well, who exactly is not powerful? Which human beings are not exactly powerful? But I do think some people don't feel like they can bring it out. They don't feel like they can show it and do it. And so I guess I would encourage everybody, men and women, to have hope that you can find your way through this so that you can each be your full self.
I love what you said, the fact that many women experience that they can access their power and ambition and accomplishment in professional contexts. And it's not the same path or journey to do so at home. There are others where it's vice versa, where you feel a lot of embodied personal power at home and finding your way professionally and in society at large is more complicated. I really wanted to be able to address it and also address the invitation to
Right.
be more of yourself as a man, whether it's to be able to collaborate with your woman or not. This is a worthwhile journey for each person and a relationship.
And I'll just say, as the man, the things that I can do to make room for my woman to be strong have to do with facing and working with my own fears on the inside, and then being able to be comfortable being a supportive partner who's providing the safe space for her to grow and flourish.
So, if this really talks to you, please do reach out about private relationship and intimacy coaching. And if you're a new listener to the podcast, well, first of all, welcome. And second of all, in my book, Uncompromising Intimacy, I share a lot of our story of how we went from loving but dehydrated to a robust, juicy, passionate marriage. So if you haven't read my book, Uncompromising Intimacy, by all means, please do. You'll get a lot from it. And it's available on Amazon and Audible. So the links in the show notes will be there for the contact page. I would love to help you create more of what you want in your relationship. You'll hear so much about what brought us to be able to have this conversation, which I never could have dreamed of when we got married almost 29 years ago.